we'll share some thoughts with you, and then hopefully we'll have time to really hear about who you are and what you're up to as well. I've also invited my dear friend and colleague and student, Angel Kennedy, to present with me today. Angel and I do a lot of work together, teaching and researching in this space. And I just also thought it's really great in GradCAMP to also, have another presenter who is, in the same boat that you are in her own way. So, Angel, did you just want to briefly introduce yourself as well after Jennifer's very generous introduction to me? Thank you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Angel Kennedy. I'm the research manager for the Reset Lab, and I'm a PhD student working with Maya. So you'll learn more about our work, our work. So I'll leave it there for now.
Great. Thanks, Angel. So Angel's controlling the slides, and I appreciate that so much. I wanted to begin because we're in the Canadian context, and Canada is a settler colonial country, as you well know, as is the United States. And one of the places that we're at right now, nationally, is to really engage this in the process of truth and reconciliation. So very much in the stage of truth telling, and also really trying to reflect on as individuals, but also as a society, what it means to be in this moment in time. And so I wanted to begin our presentation um, with an awareness of this. So also, we are connecting through this wonderful medium of the internet, but just want to acknowledge all the places that you are right now, that you're sitting in, where your feet are planted on, the floor, but also that floor is, driven deep down into the ground, and what it means to be in the place that you're in right now, what it means to have the stories that you have, and the journeys that you've walked on, and the journeys of your ancestors, and how you carry those stories with you. And to think about myself as a white settler, an uninvited guest here in Canada, on in where I am, particularly on unceded and never surrendered, so stolen Indigenous lands, particularly of the Coast Salish people. We live on the Salish Sea here in British Columbia, in the area that we're in. And so if we look up from Burnaby Mountain, where we're on top of a mountain where our university is, we look down across these territories up into beautiful inlets, and into places where people are actively protecting, defending, revitalizing Indigenous territory and tradition, medicine, knowledge. And so I hold my hands up to ancestors, past, present, and future, in these Coast Salish lands, and hold my hands up to the ancestors and the wisdom keepers of the places that you are on right now. Um, and yeah, I'm just so grateful to be in this circle of bright minds and people motivated by goodness, I think, in your work. So one of the things that we we remember when we do this work is that in our efforts to bring together in that interdisciplinary way, an understanding of the ecological and the social dimensions of climate change, which is in itself the product of a relationship between humans and the earth system, and all the pieces in between. our Indigenous colleagues and teachers, both in the US and in Canada and all across the world, remind us that this notion of connectedness and the notion of interdependence is ancient, um, and that we are coming into this space both with the opportunity to be drawing on and benefiting from um, ancient Indigenous wisdom that is being brought forward and shared. But then also we are engaging in our own Western scientific approach, and the unpacking of those approaches epistemologically and ontologically as well, um, in this effort to bring together a sense of what it means to be um, people in a time when we are dealing with anthropogenically driven climate change. So we're dealing right now with a problem that we've very much exacerbated. And so the good news there is that we have a lot of power to be able to change the systems that we've put in place that are driving climate change and the problems that are happening. So with that, um, that's a point of entry for us. And then within that, we focus a lot on health. And so what this presentation is a lot is we really kind of want to unpack for you how we put our research together, because I think sometimes with really complex, wicked problems and interdisciplinary challenges and intersectoral conundrums and so on, it's nice to just spend a little bit of time thinking about, okay, how do we actually move through this complexity, and how do we actually unpack it enough that we can get a research question out of it or a research program. And as graduate students, you'll be very much in that journey of figuring out how do you both sit in the understanding of a really big picture, but then also really focus on your particular journey through it. So when we think about health, and climate change and equity and justice, we are working within, I work within a health sciences framework. That's where Angel is located. Typically, health is imagined, even by people in the health sector, as certain things, as primary care, as, maybe public health surveillance and control, and maybe disease mitigation, and so on. So it's a real paradigm shift for the health sector as well as society more generally to think about health in this much bigger way beyond disciplines and sectors. And so we think a lot about the health of humans, animals, and ecosystems. And we're curious about how do you work in that nexus, and what does that connectivity look like? So this is a really big challenge for where does something like this fit within the context of teaching, primary care or setting up a hospital or something. So these are a lot of big ideas that we're working on and trying to figure out how to both help us health systems learn and grow and expand their remits. But yeah, also fit this kind of thinking into existing structures. When we think about climate change and human health, and the health of all beings, we are really thinking about how different climate events, such as and climate phenomena such as rising temperatures or extreme weather, rising sea level, increasing CO2 levels, and so on. What is the climactic story that is happening? And then we try and move into this understanding of the ecological stories and the environmental shifts. What, it's leading, to, for example, to impacts to water quality, food and water supply. It's leading to environmental degradation. It's leading to habitat change, which is driving disease vector ecology changes and so on. And then finally, we start getting to the health impacts. The health impacts often are first felt by animals, by environments, And eventually we start to really pay attention when they're impacting humans. And so that is one of the first things is trying to figure out how do we talk about this really complex, multi-layered, scalar kind of issue in ways that helps us think upstream to the causes of the causes, midstream to, what are the mediating factors, including policies and the structure of built environments and so on, and through down to the health impacts. I think we can go to the next slide now, Angel. So we find receptor sites for this kind of work within the health sector. This is an image more from how do we think about health system change, because we know that the way we configure institutions is leading to some of the conditions of disproportionate impacts of climate change on people, because we have structural marginalization, structural racism, and so on built into our policies and practices. But also we need to mediate and change these systems with an awareness of the way in which we need to become more climate resilient, climate aware, and climate prepared for risk and disaster. And so really what I don't want to unpack that too much, but rather to say, then we have to find in our big picture thinking these receptor sites and think about how systems and policies need to change. And so we heard from Dr. Mendez some of the different ways that he's working in those spaces to make those changes at the organizational policy level. But these are mediating the intermediary factors that we need to deal with. And on the last slide that I want to share with you, just in terms of setting up the kind of context for how we think about things, is this complex system map that's being drawn that's trying to look at the impacts of droughts on mental health. And so you can see how we slowly take a really big picture, we bring it down and bring it down and bring it down. But even when we're trying to simplify kind of the topic that we're looking at, you can see again this explosion of complexity. I think right down at the right-hand side somewhere, there's like the mental health impacts, which is something that we might be looking at. But then when we want to treat those mental health impacts, when it's related to climate change, which is about disruptions, about the breakdown of infrastructure and so on, we can see that there's this whole complexity of issues that leads us to understand the causes of health harms. And so to really figure out how to deal with the climate impacts to human health and animal health and ecosystem health, we really have to figure out how to work upstream. And one of the things that we understand in the health world around climate change and equity is that so many of our allies and so many of the policies that are leading to these health harms sit outside of the health sector, even sit outside of the regional funding structures for hospitals and so on. So it's a very interesting puzzle that we work in. But health is it's a shared value, and it's a way that we can enter into these complex climate and justice conversations around a topic that people care about and that is tangible in its outputs, like our acute suffering. But it helps us also remember this big web that we're part of. So that's kind of how we start thinking and orienting ourselves to these questions. And I'm going to pass it over to Angel, who's actually going to talk about what we actually end up doing when we're trying to move knowledge to action on climate and justice health.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. So as Maya discussed, our health research kind of takes this like eco-social lens. And so we always center priority population. Sometimes it's youth, sometimes it's our Indigenous colleagues and partners that we work with. Sometimes it's young women and girls in rural and remote communities. And then we often find ourselves at that nexus point between environment, health, education, and we really look at like research, policy, and practice in our kind of web of projects. Oh, okay. There's a siren going by, so I'm sorry if you get the background noise. So, one kind of arm of our research tends to fall within this realm of like intergenerational work. And so, one project that we have right now is focusing on education, and it's looking at how climate change is affecting the mental health of youth and children in BC in classrooms, and what curriculum change needs to occur in order to better support youth as they navigate the climate crisis. And then that one's really also taking an arts-based approach because we heard through community consultations and our work with youth that art is a big pathway to instilling like this grounded and realistic and critical hope during navigating climate change. And so we're conducting interviews with educators across BC right now. And then within the research realm of our work in the intergenerational space, we're working with researchers and communities across Canada right now who are utilizing an intergenerational justice lens in their health and climate work. And we're looking at what challenges they're encountering, what frameworks and tools they're finding helpful. And how they're really building these intergenerational partnerships sustainably and equitably, and making sure that youth are both included in the research in a good way, a way that's sustainable, and a way that isn't leading to disempowerment. And so that project has a series of hows for us. We're doing interviews across BC. We're doing youth ground truthing of those interviews and have a living repository that we've started of different frameworks that were being sent. And then we're doing a graphic recording analysis of our findings to bring in art. And then within the healthcare field, we're looking at where the story of climate change for people disappears within healthcare. So if someone is impacted by a climate event and they seek healthcare, what shows up on the reporting, and if there's metrics of climate change that come into the health space for more accurate reporting. And so that one's taking a really specific focus right now on young women and women identified persons and girls in rural and remote communities, and looking at how communities are currently supporting those populations in their plans for healthcare and where we can kind of amplify what's working and then fill gaps for what isn't working. And then a second kind of branch of our research is focused on intersectoral partnerships. And so often we find when we're working on this health and education and climate and environment and ecosystem space, that it's a very complicated web that we need to bring all of those partners into in order to be able to do this well. So we often find ourselves in this space. And so there's many projects that we're doing on this, but these are three kind of core ones that we're focusing on right now. One is a series of youth and Indigenous-led events that we're hosting to discuss water, land, climate, community, and health connections across watersheds. Maya and I are currently developing a transdisciplinary land-based field school on the rural and remote island community of Cortez, which is like 10 hours northwest of Vancouver. So it takes a long time to get there, but we're going to send some university students up there. And focusing on really updating curriculum about climate change so that it is equity and justice centered and place-based. And then we're with the same community currently working on their climate resiliency plan, and trying to fill big data gaps that we've found. And so data about Cortez will say that, I don't know, for example, roads are really good and more biking should happen. That's what data says. And so the community gets frustrated because roads are actually really bad and people die on them daily. And so that kind of suggestion from decision makers has been really damaging to being able to advance what the community sees is needed on the island. And so we've been working on trying to ground truth data with community members and really think about what it means to build in community inclusion in local climate planning and amplifying community strengths. And then the third kind of branch that we work on is interspecies. As Maya was alluding to, sometimes animals get pushed out of the narrative between human health and ecosystem health. And so we're trying to bring that back in and decenter the kind of like human-centric approach to climate change. And so there's two projects that we're trying to launch right now. One is on imagining what it looks like to take an equity-centered One Health approach to really understanding how climate change, environment, and public health are addressing related issues. And also increasing public health capacity for being able to do this multi-solving across sectors, despite being really under-resourced and overburdened. And then the second one is similar, but adding a real community focus for multi-solving and looking how multi-solving can be a framework for decision-making and multi-solving. And then we wanted to talk about equity and justice and how we include it not only in our project execution or in what we decide to research, but really in that kind of research life cycle, because we know you're all thinking about what it means to do research beginning to end, and you're doing it right now. So we integrate meaning like really purposefully equity and justice in our grant applications, in our project execution, and what we decide to focus on, and then also in our reporting and sharing. And this shows as linear, but it has many complex branches that feed back to the beginning and are iterative. So in our grant applications, we found it really helpful to develop a guiding approach of the kind of set the framework for what we focus on and how we view people when we say people in our grant applications. So we really take like a whole person, whole community, whole of life, whole of planet approach in trying to see health of people within the context of where they live and how they interact with other people, with their community, with the planet, and then their whole life. So looking at the life cycle and how like, we're not snippets in time, but we're informed by past and present and future. And then we acknowledge in our grant applications that climate change impacts human health in direct and indirect ways, but we really focus on those upstream drivers of climate change and acknowledge how they're often not in the health sector. And so that's where our intersectoral approaches are really important to all the work that we do. And then we often frame up multi-solving or co-benefits, depends on the call and who we're talking to. But it's hard when you're working on these topics because they feel this huge sense of urgency, which there is with climate change and health. And when you're thinking about the mental health of youth and global complexity that's happening, everything's really urgent and we do need to work towards solving these things. And so we see all these parallel efforts that people are putting in and parallel funding, and people are doing the same work that's getting funded twice. And so we're really focused on being intentional about looking at what people are doing and where we can help bridge initiatives and where we can work on addressing more than one of these concerns with any given pot of funding that we receive or apply to. In all of our work, we try to take an asset-based community development approach, which is really looking at community-informed action, identifying community priorities, and working with community at the speed of trust with that community. Identifying what's going well for the community, what they want to continue doing, and what they want to leverage. Really trying to support funding those trajectories in the community, and then figuring out where the research fits within that, if it does at all, or if we're just playing a supporting role. And then working on filling the knowledge gaps and having that be an iterative cycle. Maya, I'll pass it back to you for this and then I'll come back in later.
Yeah, thank you. Um, yeah, so I I think that you can probably tell that just like Dr. Mendez, who said you have to be good at doing everything, and then he works in all these different ways and so on. I think you can see that kind of a motif in this presentation of work as well. Um, we, I think there's a like a rationale behind why we're doing this work in this way. For my students, we've established the Reset Lab. And that's one way that I can support students by just grounding them in a community of practice almost together, where we hold the eco and the social, the human, animal, and ecosystem together, and that we can reflect for one another why we do this and what is the logic of that. We also are pushing back against we're kind of trying to bring in epistemic change as well, because it is really hard for our systems. It's really hard for our funding streams. It's really hard for our sectors. It's really hard for our disciplinary orientation to developing siloed expertise to think about things all together. So one of the reasons why we also think about this complexity is because it opens up the opportunity to have these kinds of conversations. Well, that doesn't fit, or that won't get funded, or this is outside of our remit. And when we have conversations about, what the artificiality of those boundaries and how we actually are living these complex and connected lives, and yet the systems, that we're trying to work within and through are not built to recognize them. We can talk about that too. So I think there's this real epistemic and kind of philosophical orientation to sort of not quite fitting in to the boxes that exist, and having an explicit commitment to be developing moral knowledge, in a sense, knowledge that tries to bring us back together. And so we think about power a lot, in terms of not only the power of people, the power of communities, the power of living experience, and the expertise of living and lived experience. So we think about power in that way. We think about who has a voice, whose voice is shifting knowledge, is shifting practice, is shifting priorities. We think about the power of organizations and our role in either reproducing or disrupting them. And we think about the power of standing in solidarity together and really listening as much as we go through the process of trying to make change and so on. And so I think power is very much a central feature and an analysis of power and an effort to shift power is very much one of the animating motivators in our work, but it doesn't always get named as an explicit goal. Next slide, please, Angel. The way that we also think about power and knowledge in this work is around data, and we've heard from Dr. Mendez about that as well. So we know that as researchers, we think that one of our roles is very much to generate knowledge and information and strategies. And so when we unpack that process, we can think a lot about, as I was saying in the previous slide, about whose voices are involved, whose agendas are reflected in the questions we're asking and the work that's getting funded and so on. So that's really important. And then when we place this question of power and knowledge, sort of this Foucauldian idea, we also place it back on the ground in the Canadian context, again, where we're orienting to this work around truth and reconciliation and, decolonizing and moving towards indigenizing as well. We are governed by not only United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for example, but also by movements such as the OCAP principles and the First Nations work to govern data. And these are binding data governance frameworks that we have in the Canadian context, in the BC context, in our provincial context, for example. There are whole data sets that are gathered by and for Indigenous peoples that white settler folks just can't access. And that's because of the harms that have been done through research as part of the colonial project, harms as well through medical research, and so on. And so we have to be really clear now about who holds knowledge, why we're gathering information, that people, it's that slogan, nothing about us without us, and so on, and who has power over using knowledge once it's gathered. And so these are the kinds of things that we also think about a lot. And also the gaps in data. So what we can and can't know through quantitative methods. We've talked about stories and storytelling here, but also what are the built-in kind of notions of racializing processes, white supremacy, patriarchal notions and so on that are built within our data sets, and how to begin to push back against them. For example, as we also talked about today, through disaggregated data and so on. Next slide, please. And Angel talked about an asset and strength-based, community-based, place-based approach to research. And of course, when we're trying to make system change, we're working with these in climate change and justice. We're working with these big global processes, super capitalism, neoliberalism, huge industries like the oil and gas industries, transportation sector, all of these things. So we are shaped by these large scale global constructs, as you know, but then they play out, in our regions, in our nation, in our national context, and so on. And we finally come down to community, where we actually, it's these places and in our personal lives where the impacts of all of these frameworks are playing out in real time. And, in the context of climate change and community and equity, we are, in a sense, in places that are going to be significantly, if they haven't already been disrupted. We're in places where communities really need to figure out how to work within their context to deal with climate events. But we are also in places where people know the areas so well, as you know, and that's why we like community-based research, those of us who do it. But communities also know how to solve problems. They know what is needed. And, this picture, if it was blowing up more, it shows all these little like little cartoon bubbles. It's like what different people actually know how to do. And if we brought all those people together, if we looked at their knowledge, if we looked at the tools we had, whether they can build a house or whether they know how a river flows or whether they know how to purify water or whether they know how to build a water break, whatever, we would have so much capacity just now in one place that we can link and harness together. And so there's something about that community-based asset and strength-based approach that raises up community voices, but also enables us, I think, to be more agile and more effective in place-based responses to climate change within acute events, but also thinking about planning for the future. And so we really think that this is an important place. And out of these conversations and collaborations, those co-benefits naturally emerge. The multi-solving naturally emerges. For example, we have an issue on the remote island we work on where the community is doing a lot of waterland restoration, which is also helping them create water reservoirs, natural basins of water for fighting wildfires. So, and it's bringing back habitats. And that just naturally evolved because people were working together across areas. Next slide, please, Angel. Yeah, and so with this image, what we really just wanted to talk about is really being authentic too in our community engagement processes. And we think a lot about how we're actually collaborating with community and what degree we're doing, and are we just kind of finding out what they want? Are we coming back and giving them plans and so on? But the whole idea here is just that we need to really think about our accountability and our collaboration with the different communities that we work with, and kind of naming what our level of engagement is, depending on at what scale we're trying to make change. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so our takeaways from our research are not only that it's how we're trying to do it, but that we really think, at least for our research projects, that a strength and asset-based approach is good, that community-based work is really important, and also thinking through with community, what are the unintended consequences of our interventions, and to be in our work on equity and justice, really thinking about who we are and what is our relationship to the issues and to the change that we want to make. So Angel, I think I'll pass it back to you for final comments.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. So then that last kind of pushing it to the end of how we share knowledge, we tend to follow an equity-focused knowledge translation approach, and there's several papers about this that kind of guide or inform our thinking in this. And so one of them is Jeff Masuda and colleagues, and in their 2014 piece, and we're curious if he'll put out a 10-year later one, which I think he should. And so the general idea of equity informed knowledge translation is both what knowledge we share needs to be equity informed and needs to call for equity actions, but then also how we're sharing it needs to be equity informed. And so that includes the techniques of how we're producing and collecting knowledge, how we're communicating knowledge and who we're communicating knowledge to in what way, and then also who has governance over that knowledge. And where responsibilities for action lie. And so Jeff and colleagues, they outline different ways to integrate equity throughout every stage of planning KT. And so in prepping KT, it's about situating yourself, looking at who you are and what knowledge you can speak to, and how you're planning on like what you're proposing happens through your lens. And then engaging in reflexive praxis, including inclusivity. So, who is included in the knowledge production? Who's giving you, as the researcher, authority to speak? And what language are you using? And what can you do differently? Where do you place responsibility for health inequities in action? And what can you in your role do differently? And then transparency. So, what knowledge is given value in work? What's the balance between listening and speaking? How much are you reflecting while listening? And then how do your contributions or findings and what you're giving out go against certain like power dynamics? And how can we ensure that our actions and what we're proposing happen don't just keep reinstilling these inequitable processes, but really try to disrupt what's happening? And then having humility. So, really being clear about what limitations you have and what your kind of claims of expertise are and what your priorities are. And then moving into transformation and making sure that the actions that we're taking are really trying to do things differently. Um, there's that saying, do better things instead of doing things better, which is trying to disrupt just staying within the status quo, but really trying to make transformative change. And Katrina Plamondon at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. She's an incredible scholar and she has a toolkit to assessing alignment between knowledge and action for health equity. And so she acknowledges that there's this kind of scale of like harmful actions, less productive actions to more productive actions, um, including like discrediting knowledge and then moving more into like the possible actions of distracting and disregarding and acknowledging, which are all like not moving to productive health equity actions. And then moving to the more productive ones are illuminating and ultimately disrupting. And so, Maya, do you want to say any last thoughts about that? Okay, then I think um, we'd love for you to stay in touch or connect with us if there's anything that you want to discuss further. And then we're looking forward to the Q&A right now and getting to hear how this is landing for you and any questions that you have.